A white cop smirks as he punches a young black man in court, thinking he's just another thug. But then the victim pulls out his attorney badge, and the entire courtroom freezes. What happens next exposes the ugly truth about racism in the justice system. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Comment below. The sky above downtown Atlanta was heavy and gray, like a storm waiting for permission. Cold wind swept between glass towers and echoed through tight alleyways, rustling newspapers and empty soda cups. The city was awake, but not fully alive, just stirring under a blanket of routine. Elijah Brooks moved through it with purpose. 26 years old, sharp lines. A tailored grey suit hugged his frame like armor. His shoes clicked in rhythm over the cracked sidewalk as he crossed Peachtree Street, the courthouse looming in the distance like a cold monument. He walked with his hands in his coat pockets and his head just slightly lowered, not in defeat, but in calculation. Always watching, always listening, always knowing he could not afford to slip. A bus pulled away, revealing the corner diner where he stopped every morning. The door chimed as he stepped inside, bringing a rush of chilled air with him. Warmth wrapped around him instantly, cooked bacon, burnt toast, strong coffee, and the murmurs of half-awake locals. "Morning, counselor," said the cook behind the counter. Elijah nodded once. "Black coffee, no sugar." He slid into the last booth by the window, the leather seat cracked from years of shift workers and late-night drifters. A few patrons glanced his way, some with recognition, others with curiosity. A young couple whispered to each other. An older white man in coveralls gave a slight nod, but did not smile. Elijah returned the gesture with quiet grace. He pulled out his phone. The lock screen showed a photo of his mother, standing proud in a church dress, her hands resting on his shoulders at his law school graduation. Her eyes held something he rarely saw in his own. Rest. Peace. Maybe even joy. He opened his photo album and scrolled slowly. A courtroom sketch of Thurgood Marshall, a snapshot of him and his firm's senior partners. He was the only black face in the lineup. A video clip of a mock trial from his first year in law school. His voice in the clip was steadier than he remembered, strong, convincing. But something inside him was quieter now. Not broken, just quieter. The waitress placed his coffee on the table. He whispered, "Thank you," without looking up. He lifted the cup, held it beneath his nose, let the steam touch his skin, then sipped. The bitterness grounded him. Outside the window, the courthouse stood like it always did. Silent, stone-faced. But to Elijah, it was not just a building. It was a battleground. A place where words had weight, where truth could still cut through noise, if spoken loud enough, and by the right voice. But the right voice was not always listened to. He thought about yesterday, how the judge barely glanced at him during the hearing, how the opposing counsel had called him kid 3 times, how his own client had looked at him sideways, unsure whether to trust him. Elijah had won the motion anyway, but the victory felt borrowed, not owned. He looked down at his hands. They were steady, strong, but even strength could feel invisible when worn under brown skin. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a leather badge wallet. Inside, his state bar card gleamed beneath the plastic. His name etched in bold, Elijah C. Brooks, Esquire. Sometimes he looked at it just to remind himself that he was real, that he belonged here, that he had earned this. Every long night, every slammed door, every time someone said, "Are you the intern?" He took another sip of coffee, then stood. As he stepped out into the cold again, the courthouse bell rang 8 a.m. The wind picked up. A paper cup danced along the sidewalk beside him. The street hummed with distant sirens. He adjusted his tie, crossed the street. Every step toward the courthouse felt like stepping onto sacred ground. He had told himself that once, that justice was holy, that the courtroom was a place where things could be made right. But lately, it felt more like walking into a fire with only his name to shield him. Still, he walked forward. The courthouse doors swung open with a hiss of compressed air. Inside, polished marble reflected cold, fluorescent lights. The security line stretched halfway across the lobby, winding between chrome barriers like a slow-moving river of briefcases and worn-out faces. Elijah joined the line, quiet and alert. He stood behind a man in a wrinkled blazer and ahead of a woman arguing on the phone. The hum of complaints, shuffling feet, and the distant echo of a judge's gavel gave the building its usual rhythm. But something in the air today felt off. At the front of the line, a pair of deputies scanned bags and waved people through the metal detector. One of them, Officer Grayson, was hard to miss. Tall, white, buzzed haircut, broad chest tucked into a too-tight uniform. His badge was clean. His stare was not. Elijah had seen him before. The type of man who smirked when he called you boy, but said it just soft enough to deny it later. "Next!" Grayson barked. The man in the wrinkled blazer walked through. The woman followed, still talking into her phone. Elijah stepped up, calm, polished, professional. He placed his briefcase on the conveyor belt, removed his coat, emptied his pockets with the care of a man who had done this ritual far too many times. Then he stepped through the metal detector. Beep. Nothing. He reached for his belongings. "Hold up," Grayson said, stepping forward. "You got some ID?" Elijah blinked. "Yes, of course." He pulled his wallet from the tray, opened it, and held out his bar card and driver's license. Grayson squinted, took the cards without asking, held them up to the light like they were fake. "Elijah Brooks," he read aloud, voice just loud enough to be heard by people nearby. "And this is... what? You the attorney?" "Yes," Elijah replied carefully. "I am representing a client in courtroom 2B this morning." Grayson tilted his head. "Uh-huh." He looked Elijah over, from the shoes to the clean haircut, then back to the ID. "You know," Grayson said, smirking, "this looks a lot like a card someone might steal." Elijah's stomach twisted. Around them, the line slowed. A few people turned. One man chuckled. A woman covered her mouth with her hand, not in shock but amusement. "I assure you, officer," Elijah said, keeping his voice low, "this is mine." Grayson stepped closer. Too close. "You expect me to believe some street kid got himself a law degree?" he said. "Come on, man, be real." Elijah felt every word like a slap to the chest. The humiliation was not just in the words, it was in the ease, the casual nature of it. Like it was routine. Like he was the one who was out of place, daring to stand tall where others thought he should kneel. But he stayed still. There was heat in his throat, but he swallowed it, his jaw locked, his eyes held steady. Grayson stared at him a moment longer, then tossed the cards back on the tray. "Go ahead," he muttered, as if doing Elijah a favor. Elijah gathered his things in silence. No thank you, no apology. Just the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He walked away slowly, past a group of junior lawyers from another firm. They avoided eye contact. One of them whispered something behind a hand. He heard the word intern. He kept walking. In the far hallway just before turning the corner, he paused. The walls were lined with framed portraits of past judges, old men, pale faces, powdered wigs, proud smiles. He stared at them a moment. None looked like him. Elijah's shoes tapped softly down the courthouse hallway, echoing louder than they should have. He walked with purpose, but something in his chest felt tight, like the morning had already gone too far off course. He paused outside courtroom 2A, adjusting the papers in his folder. His real case was scheduled for 2B, but he wanted to check something first. A juvenile case from last week had been reassigned. He remembered the defendant's name, Malik Johnson, 16, first offense. Accused of resisting arrest during a stop for jaywalking. Elijah had seen the arrest footage. The boy had not resisted. He had flinched. The courtroom door creaked as Elijah stepped inside. Rows of wooden benches stretched toward the bench, mostly empty. Only a handful of people waited. Family members, clerks, and 2 officers near the back wall. Elijah's eyes went straight to the defense table. There he was. Malik, handcuffed, shoulders hunched, eyes wide. A public defender beside him flipped through paperwork without saying a word. The boy's shoes looked too big, his hoodie swallowed his frame, and his gaze darted across the room like a trapped animal. Before Elijah could think, he took another step forward. That was when he heard the voice. "Well, well. You lost, Brooks." Elijah turned. Officer Grayson leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, lips curled into a grin. "Or you just casing the place," he added, pushing off the wall and walking toward him slowly. The courtroom had not yet come to order. The judge's seat was empty. The court clerk was busy organizing files. No one moved to stop the exchange. "I am here to observe," Elijah said, voice firm but even. "Malik Johnson is my concern." Grayson's smile widened. "Oh, got it," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Came to check on your little cousin. Makes sense. Keeping it in the family." A soft laugh came from one of the officers in the back. The public defender barely looked up. Even the clerk froze for half a second, then returned to her work. Elijah's jaw twitched, but he did not respond. Grayson stepped closer, voice lowering. "You know what I see when I look at you? Another kid trying to play dress-up. You clean up nice, but let's not pretend." Elijah locked eyes with him. The silence stretched between them like glass about to crack. Then Grayson leaned back, turned his body toward the others in the room, and said, almost cheerfully, "Man walks in like he owns the place. Bet his suit costs more than my car. Funny how far a little affirmative action will take you." The words fell like bricks. Malik looked up now. His eyes met Elijah's. There was something in them, confusion, yes, but also hope, the kind that begged, "Is he really one of us? Will he say something?" Elijah wanted to. Every muscle in his chest tightened, every thought in his head collided at once. But he said nothing. Not here. Not yet. He turned and walked out, shoulders square, pace even. But inside, something cracked. Outside the courtroom, the hallway buzzed. A group of attorneys in smart suits whispered near the elevators. One of them, a young white woman with sharp eyes and a clipboard, glanced at Elijah and turned away without a word. Another whispered something to her. They both laughed behind their hands. He was no longer sure what they were laughing about. But he felt the sting anyway. He walked down the hall, past the portraits of old judges again. This time he did not look at them. He made it to the bathroom at the end of the hall, locked himself in a stall, sat down on the toilet lid, folder still in his lap. His hands were shaking. The insults were not new, but the publicness of it, the room full of people, the silence, the acceptance, it made him feel invisible. Or worse, it made him feel exactly how they wanted him to feel. Small, alone. You do not belong here. That was the real message, spoken without saying, passed down through stares, chuckles, and sideways glances. A message carved into every wall, every marble tile of that courthouse. He looked at his own name, still printed on the folder in his lap. Still crisp, still real. But for the first time in a long time, Elijah wondered if it even mattered. He wanted to disappear. But then he thought about Malik. That look in the boy's eyes. He had seen it before. He had worn it once. The courthouse bathroom was still. Only the hum of the overhead lights broke the silence. Elijah leaned over the sink now, splashing cold water onto his face, watching the drops fall and scatter like tiny stars. He stared into the mirror. What looked back at him was not the clean-cut attorney he had become, but the boy he used to be. Dark skin, tired eyes, pressed lips, trying to hold it together, always holding it together. He blinked, and the present fell away. It was summer in Marietta. The air was hot and sticky. Elijah was 11 years old and riding his bike home from the library, backpack heavy with books. He had just discovered Langston Hughes and checked out every title he could carry. The world felt safe back then, small but safe, until the sirens started behind him. He heard the screech of tires, then a voice, sharp and angry, shouting from a police cruiser, "Get off the bike! Hands up!" Elijah froze. He thought maybe they were talking to someone else. They were not. He dropped the bike, raised his trembling hands. His books spilled onto the street, paperbacks sliding across the asphalt. Then they grabbed him. 2 white officers, big hands, hard voices. They slammed him onto the hood of the cruiser, his cheek scraping against hot metal. He screamed. One officer yelled, "Stop resisting!" though Elijah had not moved. From the porch of their apartment complex, his mother ran barefoot, still wearing her nightgown. Her voice cracked the air like thunder. "Get off my baby! He is a child! He is a child!" The officers looked confused, then irritated, then embarrassed. They had the wrong kid. Someone had stolen a bike around the corner. The description? Black male, young, on a red bicycle. That was it. They let him go. No apology, no explanation, just drove off. Elijah sat on the curb, shaking, watching his mother pick up his books one by one with trembling fingers. She tried not to cry, but he saw the tears behind her glasses. Later that night, she sat beside him on his bed, held his hand. "You are not broken," she whispered. "You are just seen differently, but that does not mean you stop trying. You hear me? You fight harder. You move smarter. You stand. Because one day, baby, you will walk into a room and they will have to listen." He nodded, but he did not understand it yet. Years passed. He went to school, kept his head down, read more books, joined the debate team, got a scholarship, made it to law school, passed the bar on his first try. But through all of it, that summer day lived just beneath the surface, not always visible, but never gone. Every insult, every doubtful glance, every client who said, "You are the lawyer," before he even introduced himself. It all traced back to that moment. That day he realized the law was not built for him, but he could learn it, and wield it, and one day bend it toward justice. Back in the courthouse bathroom, Elijah stared again at the mirror. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the same old bar card. Not for validation, not this time, but as a weapon, a reminder, a vow. He ran his thumb across the edge of it, then took a deep breath. "I cannot let this happen again," he said out loud, not just to himself, but to that 11-year-old boy sitting on the curb, to Malik, handcuffed in courtroom 2A, to his mother, whose voice still echoed in his ears. It was no longer about being disrespected. It was about what came next. Elijah stepped out of the bathroom, his face dry now, his steps slower but sharper. The courthouse hallway bustled around him, lawyers clicking by in heels and polished loafers, bailiffs chatting at the end of the corridor, a crying child gripping her father's hand. But Elijah moved through it all like a man with tunnel vision. He found a bench just outside courtroom 2B. The case he was supposed to argue would start in 20 minutes. He opened the folder, scanned the client's paperwork, but his mind was elsewhere. Malik. That boy's eyes had said everything. Fear, confusion, hope. Elijah leaned back against the cold stone wall and closed his eyes. He could still hear Grayson's voice, smug, sharp, soaked in assumption. The laughter, the silence, the way no one said a word when it all happened. But it was not just about Grayson anymore. It was about the room that let it happen. Elijah opened his eyes and pulled out his phone. He scrolled to a contact labeled simply, Judge H. Harmon. She was one of the few, an older black woman. Stern but fair. Respected. She had once told Elijah, "You speak like a man who knows how long silence can last. That is why I trust your voice." His thumb hovered for a moment. Then he called. The line rang twice before she picked up. Her voice came through, crisp and direct. "Brooks, you better not be calling me for an extension." "No, ma'am," Elijah said. "I need something else. I want to represent a minor in 2A, Malik Johnson." A pause. "Public defender dropped the ball?" she asked. "He does not see him," Elijah replied. "And if he is not seen now, he never will be." Judge Harmon let out a slow breath. "Fine. You are assigned as of now. But do not let this derail your own docket. Understood?" "Yes, Your Honor." He hung up, pocketed the phone, exhaled. The shift was internal, but it changed everything. No fanfare, no dramatic music, just clarity. He stood and walked back down the hallway, the same direction he had come from earlier, this time with intention. When he reached Courtroom 2A, the doors were open again. People had filed in. Malik still sat there, small and silent, eyes on the floor. The judge had not arrived yet. Officer Grayson was back by the wall, arms crossed again, watching like a lion who had already claimed his territory. Elijah walked in, not loud, not fast, but undeniable. He stepped beside Malik and bent slightly, offering a calm, quiet voice. "My name is Elijah Brooks. I am your attorney now." Malik looked up, confused. "For real?" Elijah gave a nod. "For real." The public defender said nothing, just packed up and slipped away, almost relieved. Malik stared at Elijah like someone had opened a door he did not know was there. Elijah took out a yellow legal pad, scribbled a few notes, leaned in again. "We will fight this the right way. I will not let them turn you into what they already think you are." Malik nodded slowly, still unsure, still scared, but no longer alone. Across the room, Officer Grayson narrowed his eyes. His smirk was gone now. Elijah did not look at him. He did not need to. Whatever came next, he was ready for it. And the courtroom would remember what a man like him looked like when he stood in his full power. The courtroom was humming with low voices, shuffling papers, nervous coughs. The judge had not arrived yet, but the room was full. Spectators in the back, court staff moving briskly, and Officer Grayson stationed by the far wall, arms folded, posture hard. Elijah stood at the defense table beside Malik. The boy sat straighter now, still handcuffed, but different. The weight of silence no longer rested on his shoulders alone. The door behind the bench opened. Judge Harmon stepped in, her black robe flowing, silver-framed glasses perched low on her nose. She took her seat and tapped the gavel. "Court is now in session," she said. "Docket number 4837, the State of Georgia vs. Malik Johnson." She glanced at the paperwork, then at the defense table. "Counsel, state your name for the record." Elijah stepped forward, his voice clear and calm. "Attorney Elijah Brooks, Your Honor. I am representing Mr. Johnson, having received permission to substitute counsel this morning." A few people in the courtroom looked up. Whispers. That name meant something to them. Judge Harmon nodded once. Noted. Proceed. The prosecutor stood and began rattling off the charges: resisting arrest, disorderly conduct, obstruction. Elijah listened carefully. He let the words land, heavy and wrong. Then he turned to Malik, spoke quietly in his ear. "You will not speak today. Let me do this. Just watch." Malik nodded, eyes locked on him. Elijah rose. "Your Honor," he began, "before we discuss charges, I would like to introduce into the record a short video." Judge Harmon gestured for him to continue. Elijah tapped his tablet. The bailiff connected it to the monitor. A grainy video filled the screen. Body cam footage. The moment of Malik's arrest. There was no resistance, no swinging, just fear. A boy flinching as the officer lunged toward him, yelling and slamming him against a patrol car. The courtroom watched in silence. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. Elijah let the footage play, then paused it on one frame, Malik's face frozen in fear, eyes wide, mouth open, mid-scream. "Does this," Elijah said softly, "look like a threat to public safety? Or does it look like a child being swallowed by a system designed to forget him?" The silence was deep now, thick. Then came a voice. From the wall. Officer Grayson. "Come on, Judge," he called out. "Are we really buying this emotional show? That boy's no victim." Elijah turned his head, slowly, steadily. "You are out of line," Judge Harmon said, her voice firm. But Grayson kept going. "And this one," he said, pointing straight at Elijah, "he is no better. Walks in here with his fancy suit, acting like he owns the place. Playing hero for the camera." He stepped forward. Elijah did not move. Grayson's face twisted. "You think your degree protects you? You think people like you belong in here?" And then, like lightning, he shoved the defense table, hard. The courtroom gasped. Malik flinched. Elijah stepped between them instantly. In a flash, Grayson's fist flew. A loud smack echoed through the room. The courtroom fell dead silent. Elijah stumbled back a step, but stayed standing. He did not yell. He did not raise his hands. Instead, he reached down calmly, opened his briefcase, pulled out a slim leather wallet, then held it up. Inside, gleaming under the courtroom lights, was his attorney's badge. He looked Officer Grayson dead in the eyes. "My name," he said slowly, voice echoing, "is Attorney Elijah Brooks, State Bar number 897462. Officer Grayson, you have just struck a licensed officer of the court, in front of a sitting judge." Gasps rippled through the room. A woman in the back stood. Phones came out. Someone whispered, "Oh my God, he is a lawyer." Another voice, "He just hit a lawyer." Malik sat frozen, staring up at Elijah like he was seeing a superhero. Judge Harmon's gavel cracked like thunder. "Officer Grayson," she snapped, "step away from the defense table. Bailiff, secure him now." Two officers moved fast. Grayson's mouth fell open, stunned. He tried to protest, but no one listened this time. The same courtroom that had been silent hours ago was now wide awake. Eyes that had once avoided Elijah now locked onto him, full of realization. "Your Honor," Elijah said, voice steady, "I would like to file an immediate motion to dismiss all charges against Mr. Johnson on grounds of unlawful arrest, bias, and now, a compromised courtroom process." Judge Harmon nodded. Motion granted, case dismissed. A gavel fell, a chain broke, and in that moment, the room shifted, not just legally, but spiritually. Elijah turned to Malik and put a hand on his shoulder. "You are going home," he said quietly. Malik nodded, but his eyes were wide with something deeper than relief. Pride. Elijah looked out across the courtroom one last time. They had all seen him now. Not just the suit. Not just the badge. Him. What would you have done if that punch was meant for you? Would you have kept standing tall? The video spread like fire. Within hours, the courtroom footage had been uploaded, clipped, shared, dissected. The punch, the badge, the silence that followed. Elijah's name trended across social media platforms, some cheering, others asking questions, but all of them watching. And for once, watching meant witnessing. By the next morning, the courthouse was different. Not quieter, just aware. Elijah walked in through the same doors he had always used, the same security line, the same marble floors. But this time, no one stopped him. Officer Grayson was gone, suspended without pay. An internal investigation had begun. The official statement cited excessive force, but Elijah knew it was more than that. It was the weight of 100 little wrongs finally tipping the scale. In the hallway, the same junior lawyers from before stood near the elevators. One of them, same sharp-eyed woman who once laughed behind her hand, looked up and gave Elijah a small nod. Not forced, not performative, just respect. Another lawyer, an older white man with a heavy briefcase, stepped aside as Elijah passed. "Brooks," he said, offering a hand. Elijah shook it without a word. He was not seeking approval. But the shift was undeniable. In Judge Harmon's chambers later that day, she sat with Elijah over a mug of black tea. "You have made a lot of people uncomfortable," she said, not unkindly. "I was not trying to," Elijah replied. She raised an eyebrow. "Good, because if you were, I would be worried. Real change does not come from a raised voice. It comes from a raised standard." She leaned forward slightly. "You raised it." Elijah said nothing, but inside, something exhaled. Later that week, new training policies were issued to all courthouse officers. Officers were instructed on implicit bias, courtroom boundaries, and professional conduct with attorneys, regardless of race, age, or appearance. Judge Harmon sent a memo to the State Bar Association. It included a full transcript of the incident, a copy of the video, and one line that stood out. "Let this serve as record. Attorney Elijah Brooks upheld the dignity of this court when others failed to. Let his professionalism be the standard we expect, not the exception we tolerate." That memo made it into the state newsletter. His firm partners called him in. For once, not with polite questions or quiet doubt, but with a clear offer. Lead a new branch initiative for at-risk youth defense. He said yes, not because it was a promotion, but because Malik's seat was still warm in his mind. Speaking of Malik, the boy showed up 2 weeks later, not in cuffs, not in fear, but in khakis and an oversized button-up, holding a manila envelope. "I want to learn," he said, eyes lowered, but voice steady. "I want to be like you." Elijah gave him a desk, a notepad, a job as a summer intern. No pay, just purpose. Malik showed up early every day after that, shoes too clean, shirt tucked too tight, but eyes full of something Elijah had not seen before: belonging. One afternoon, they walked together through the courthouse halls. People looked at them, some curious, some smiling, a few still unsure. But none looked away. It was nearly sunset. Atlanta's skyline shimmered gold, the tall buildings casting long shadows across the cemetery just outside the city. Elijah stood quietly between 2 rows of headstones, his coat folded over his arm, the autumn wind tugging gently at his collar. He found the grave easily. Marlene Brooks, 1959 to 2019. "Your voice will carry farther than mine ever could." He knelt and brushed a few fallen leaves from the marble, then sat beside it, legs stretched out in the grass, the way he used to sit with her in the park, back when the world felt slower. His fingers traced the name. The silence around him was peaceful now, not heavy. He spoke softly. "I did not hit back, Ma, not with fists, but I hit back with the truth, with presence, with that badge you always told me to carry like a sword." He smiled, tired but full. "They tried to shrink me again, in front of everyone. But this time, I stayed standing." His voice cracked on the last word. He did not wipe the tear that followed. Footsteps approached behind him. Elijah turned to see Malik, walking carefully between the headstones, dressed in the same too-big button-up, a little neater today. He held a single sunflower in his hand, bright yellow, stubborn against the fall air. "Is it okay if I—" he asked. Elijah nodded. Malik knelt beside the grave, laid the flower gently across the stone. He did not say anything, but he did not need to. His silence spoke the language Elijah's mother would have understood best. Respect. Hope. Thanks. They sat there a while. Two shadows stretched across the grass. One grown, one still growing, neither perfect, both present. As the sun dipped lower, Elijah finally stood, looked out across the skyline, the courthouse barely visible in the distance. "You know," he said, "for a long time, I thought the courtroom was a battlefield." Malik looked up at him. "But I think I was wrong." Elijah's eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. "It is sacred ground, not because it is always fair, but because it is where truth gets its turn. Where people like us are told we do not belong, so we show up anyway, and we make room." He turned back to Malik. "And now that room is yours too." Malik did not speak. He just nodded, eyes brighter than they had been the first day. The two of them walked back toward the car in silence. Not heavy silence this time, but full, like the world had shifted just enough to breathe again. At the edge of the lot, Elijah paused, looked back one more time. His mother's headstone caught the last of the light. He whispered a final line, quiet but clear. "Maybe the courtroom will never be safe, but it can be sacred, and I will make it that way." Have you ever fought silently, just to prove you belonged? How did it change you?